Okay. All right. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much to both Lonnie and Andy for this wonderful invitation. It is a privilege and an honor to be able to share with you all this afternoon my heart and my passion regarding the intersections of African American literature and music. And I'm just so pleased to be here with you all to share this sort of transdisciplinary passion that I have along these intersections of literature, music, and theology. Today, though, we will focus on the work of Toni Morrison and the intersection of Black music performance. More importantly and specifically, I will delve into Black music aesthetics in her 1987 novel, Beloved. Morrison's novel, Beloved, is a classic example of the transdisciplinary intersection that my research encompasses in literature, music, and theology. And before we begin, I wanted to start with a short recapitulation of Toni Morrison's documentary pieces, I Am, and perhaps and I would sort of share that on my laptop, but before technical reasons, what we will do is I will email all of the links and all of the sound clips that I have included in my presentation, and that way you all will be able to examine those as efficaciously as possible. With the time that's allotted today, I want to first give background on the reason why Toni Morrison incorporates music in her iconic literature. We will look at examples by Emily Lordy, Daphne Brooks, specifying the intersection of music and literature involving Morrison. And I will also provide background on the novel, giving a short recapitulation of the text. Then we will delve into specific passages that highlight Black music performance in all of its forms, in spirituals, folk songs, and blues music. And again, I will provide the links so that after the presentation is over, you all will be able to hear effectively all of the sound clips that I've included in my presentation. And I'm also aware that many of you have been given the pages in advance that we will cover. So my inspiration for this workshop and the original course that I teach at Rutgers University, Newark, entitled Morrison and Music, is an original course title from my own research. At the time of Morrison's passing in August of 2019, I wanted undergraduate students to get a real sense, an authentic sense of who Toni Morrison was and is as a writer. I didn't want students leaving campus or the university not knowing what a gem we had and still have with Toni Morrison in the Black literary canon. This course could indeed be a graduate course, my Morrison and Music seminar, but I fashioned it into an undergraduate seminar with music as the overarching mode of analysis and framework for literary students. I have learned in my 16 years of teaching that the most efficacious way to reach students is through a universal implement, a universal tool that speaks to them directly, and that is music. Because I am a professor of African American literature, my research and teaching methods use music as a pedagogical implement for further comprehension for students. The purpose of this workshop today and is to get undergraduate students who may not have an interest in English literature as a major or the humanities in general intrigued, and you can only implement that through the passion you have for your own work and through an artistic avenue such as this. This course was developed from my own passion and original research branding in African American literature and Black music performance. And I want to share that passion with you all today, this afternoon, as faculty, as well as various methodological approaches to reading, writing, and witnessing the melody in the Black literary canon. And I do have, as you can see, sort of a screenshot of the documentary. But again, I will put the link of the documentary trailer from 2019 in the chat after the presentation. Who is Toni Morrison? We all should know who Toni Morrison is, but I'll provide a brief biographical sketch. Toni Morrison was born Chloe Anthony Wolford Morrison in 1931, and she passed August of 2019. Her first novel, The Bluest Eye, was published in 1970, and since then we've had an array of literature. Sula in 1973, Song of Solomon in 1977, Tar Baby in 1981, Beloved, as you can see here, in 1987, Jazz in 1992, Paradise 1997, Love 2003, A Mercy 2008, Home, and God Bless and God Help the Child in 2012 and 2015, respectively. Toni has also published an array of essays, Playing in the Dark and The Source of Self-Regard, which I highly recommend as supplemental texts for your students to read. These texts, especially The Source of Self-Regard, is a compilation of essays, will give your students a glimpse into the themes of race, gender, and identity in Toni Morrison's own words. Beloved was published in 1987 and won the Pulitzer Prize for Fiction in 1988, a year later. It is a novel that is set in 1873 in Cincinnati, Ohio, in Mr. Gardner's sweet home plantation in Kentucky. And it contains the characters Setha, former slave, Denver, 18-year-old daughter, and Setha's mother-in-law, Baby Suggs Holy, which we will discuss later on in the presentation. Beloved is also based on the true story of Margaret Garner, who escaped with her family from slavery in Kentucky to freedom in Ohio in 1856. When the family was apprehended under the Fugitive Slave Act, Margaret murdered one of her children before she would let that child actually become a slave. We also have the characters Paul D., Stampede, Hal, and Schoolteacher. Beloved is the embodied spirit of Setha's dead daughter. The themes that encompass Beloved are community, identity, death, power of language, spirituality, theology, and family. There are two other themes that might be reserved for a graduate class, but I'm going to give them to you all here. Beloved is both exegetical, and we can discuss these terms in the Q&A as well. Beloved is both exegetical and eschatological in content and context. It is exegetical in that Morrison's inclusion of scripture and the nature of Black spirituality within the antebellum epoch. Beloved is also eschatological as it relates to death and resurrection in the novel. Why is Black music of particular interest to Toni? In an article in the New Yorker entitled Toni Morrison and Nina Simone, United in Soul, Emily Lordy writes, quote, Toni Morrison was such an exceptional talent and seemed to float so high above the fray that it's easy to forget that she was a product of her time. But she was profoundly influenced by the work of contemporary musicians. She wanted her writing to emulate all of the intricacy, all of the discipline that she heard in Black music performance. And the reason why I'm specifying these two particular authors and the articles that they wrote is that it's important for undergraduate students to know the reason why Black music performance is so important in the novels of Toni Morrison, and why we're actually providing background on it before we get into the passages. Also, in the article with Daphne Brooks, Daphne tells readers of her encounter with the legendary literary lioness Toni Morrison. Morrison herself asks Daphne to lecture in one of her classes on the ugly history of blackface minstrelsy in America. It is here that Brooks is firsthand witness to Morrison as a, quote, rebel sister theorist of music. Brooks asserts that Morrison was interested in the, quote, articularity of sound and made the case for music as an insurgent expression of Black interiority, end quote. Indeed, music was always reinventing the center of American life. Brooks also mentions Morrison's incorporation of blues poetry, spiritual ethics that mimic the sonic arc of gospel and bebop jazz studio sessions. This was Morrison. There are instances as well at the end of Beloved of the singing women, where the women with their sonic voices exorcise the ghosts of slavery. Her novel, Jazz, is also the literary epitome of improvisation, as she spells out the phrasings of Black life with a sonic framework. Morrison herself was surrounded by music all of her life. She said members of her family could not read music, but they could hear it and repeat it. Her mother sang opera, arias, jazz, and blues. And I want to read a bit of a passage where Morrison ruminates the essence of Nina Simone. Morrison says about Nina Simone, quote, "Her manipulation of lyrics was so unique, so scorching, so heartbreaking. I knew mine would pale in that company. Words literally failed me. All I could think of was, she saved our lives. Meaning, I suppose, that she led us to believe, with little true to life evidence to support it, that we could do it. Fight injustice rather than suffer it. Survive loss, come to terms with betrayal, be brutally honest, disarmingly tender, have regrets minus apology, and not just taste the fullness of life, but drink it down. So long, that is, as we respected and demanded respect for our work. Nina Simone knew the danger and courted it. There was nothing about it that was generic or sentimental or tricky. It was specific and personal, the fusion of a classic artist and a committed activist. Hers was a magical feat, where church, clubs, concert halls, bedrooms, and streets met and embraced each other. For her, music, or art, is not entertainment, although it may please, is not limited to expression, although it must do that, is not information, although it may contain much, but it is a serious cultural landscape without which there is no culture and no land. This, I want to show you all, is the importance of music in Morrison. Music for Toni Morrison, as Brooks writes, quote, was not only inside her and for her, it was about her. So these articles are really important to show undergraduate students, first, the importance of music in Toni Morrison's literature. When we think about Toni Morrison, we think about the ways in which music has played a vital role in her novels. For example, very quickly, and I have an example here, and I can also play it on my laptop. Recitative is an example of the ways in which Morrison writes music into the lives of her characters metaphorically. Recitative is Morrison's first short story published in 1983 in an anthology edited by Amiri Baraka called Confirmation. The term recitative alludes to the tone or rhythm peculiar to any language. The story brings together the rhythm of two lives for 5 moments narrated in Twyla's voice. The title also alludes to a style of musical declamation that hovers between song and ordinary speech. The story is about 2 girls, as we know, Roberta and Twyla, from their meeting as roommates at the age of 8 in a children's shelter. And this story traces their childhood with themes of memory, race, childhood, and prejudice. One Black, one white, but the narrator doesn't specify which child is which race. That choice is left to the reader. Maggie is also a character in the story who is a symbol for the oppressed. Recitative is a prime example that Morrison uses to tell a story musically. And so for your undergraduate students, before delving into the specific of the passages of Beloved or Jazz or any other novel that Morrison has wrote, I think that recitative is actually a wonderful musical example to demonstrate to them first, within perhaps maybe the first 2 weeks of class. Maggie is also a character in the story who is a symbol for the oppressed. And you can imagine that even if there isn't theory in the music, you can read music metaphorically within the narrative. The 5 short vignettes or moments in the break between each character's growth and age in the short story, you can actually imagine a musical recitative playing in between those breaks. And so before we delve into the passages of Toni Morrison, I have an example in my presentation that I wanted to show for you all. Here we go. So I'm going to play a little bit of this clip from my laptop, as Andy specified, and I do pray that you all can hear. If not, don't worry, we will send the links momentarily. And you may hear an ad or two first.
It's known as recitativo, or recitativo, or however you want to pronounce it, a word which you certainly know is somehow connected with opera, but perhaps are a bit foggy about. What is this recitative anyway? Well, let's suppose that I'm in a musical show whose plot calls upon me to inform my wife that chicken has gone up 3 cents a pound. Now, in an ordinary show, I would simply say to her, "Dear, chicken is up 3 cents a pound," and then my wife would probably burst forth into a lament about the high cost of living. But in an opera, I would sing my line, and so I would have to resort to recitative, let's say in the style of Mozart, like this. "Susanna, I have something terrible to tell you. I've just been talking to the butcher, and he tells me that the price of chicken has gone up 3 cents a pound. Please don't be too depressed, dear." Now, that's not terribly expressive. It's rather close to plain speech, except for an intermittent piano chord, and it's not particularly descriptive of my feelings about chicken. But of course, I could get more dramatic in the style of Verdi, something like this. "Gilda, il prezzo di pollo è montato, 3 soldi per grammo." Now, if Wagner had been concerned with the high price of chicken, he might have put it this way. But no matter.
Okay, so there's more to that video, but I just wanted to display to you all an example musically of what recitative is, and I gave the definitions here, and then the ways in which you can explicate music in the short story with your students. Now, let's delve into the passages. Because of time, I'm going to highlight just 3 of the 5 passages that you all have in advance that include music in Toni Morrison's Beloved. We already know what the story is about, the characters, and of course you'll tell your classes this. And now it's time to delve into the musicality, historically and contextually within Beloved. While we are going through these passages, ask your students to think about where music matters the most in these instances. In what environments do you witness the melody, i.e., in the keeping room that we'll see in just a moment, where there's warmth, on the railroad with the work songs and Paul D, in the clearing with Baby Suggs Holy, and at the end of the novel where the singing women help Sethe exorcise the ghost of Beloved. Kneeling in the keeping room. The keeping room was a space where anyone who was not cooking in the kitchen sat or slept to stay out of the way, but could still take advantage of the heat. The keeping room was a place of warmth, and this is on page 46 to 47. The keeping room was a place of warmth or hearth rooms. In this space is where Paul D sang. The songs that are explicated here are called work songs. In the work songs, you sang while you labored. The labor became a part of the music, the melody. Also on page 128, if we read, "They chain danced over the fields through the woods to a trail that ended in the astonishing beauty of feldspar, and there Paul D's hands disobeyed the furious rippling of his blood and paid attention. With a sledgehammer in his hands and high man's lead, The men got through. They sang it out and beat it up, garbling the words so they could not understand. Garbling the words so they could not be understood, tricking the words so their syllables yielded up other meanings. They sang the women they knew, the children they had been, the animals they had tamed themselves or seen others tame. They sang of bosses and masters and misses, of mules and dogs and the shamelessness of life. They sang lovingly of graveyards and sisters long gone, of pork in the woods, meal in the pan, fish on the line, cane, rain, and rocking chairs. I have an example of the work songs as well to be played here. And I'm going to play this on my laptop. All right, here we go. There's an ad that's playing. I must wait for that to subside first. Here we go. Sell the job and I get myself a wife. Oh, yeah, now in the pen. The place again. Thinking of me to stick it at home. All right, so that's one example of work songs that you can actually play for your students so that they understand the context. There's another work song as well that I had in the presentation, and it goes like this. Oh, Emma, oh, you turned me hole in the ground. Oh, Emma, oh, oh, Emma, oh. You turned me hole in the ground. Say, Emma, you free. You turned me hole. Emma, help me to pull these weeds. You turned me hole. Okay, so there's a short example as well. And again, I will include all of those in the chat. Pages 102 to 104, Baby Suggs' Holy Songs in the Clearing. There is, I'm going to exit this presentation and go to this one. Songs in the Clearing, all right? Before Baby Suggs' holy sermon in Morrison's novel, she makes her way to the clearing or the open field. And what I'm doing here is I'm giving you all specific environments, specific examples of where music is found in Beloved. Plantations were sites of terror, and Black slaves subversively held religious gatherings in fields or wherever they could find space to release their cries for freedom. The clearing was Baby Suggs' holy field. That, which was once considered a death site, is now turned into a site of liberation in the clearing. In the passage of Morrison's novel, Baby Suggs travels to the clearing as the sun is out and leaves dance in the breeze. Her community waits for her words to offer solace, joy, and a new realm of thought about themselves, a seed, a word of upliftment that would take root as they plant it deeply within their souls. After baby Suggs prays in the clearing, she calls for the children, then the men, and then the women. She instructs the women to cry for the living and the dead. And this is where the sonic passage is. The sounds of joy, grief, sorrow, and pain, the sounds of all the feelings endured by Black bodies and minds, and the image of dance and music all commence before the Black woman's sermon. Similarly, in scripture, before battle commenced, the Levites or musicians were called forth to make a victorious sound with their instruments and voices. This particular scene in Beloved is reminiscent of a song being sung before and after the sermon in a house of worship. But here, the spells of crying, lamenting, and dancing among the women, men, and children before baby Suggs' sermon in the clearing represent the psychic cacophony and constant battle between joy and remorse that Black flesh endures. After the dancing and crying, everyone is gasping for air, the men, women, and the children. They cannot breathe and are exhausted. Essentially, even before the sermon begins, baby Suggs' leadership acts as a sonic healing balm to the cacophony of sound and motion from the community in the clearing. As Morrison writes, when the preaching began, baby Suggs offered up her great big heart with what it contained. Morrison continues, she did not tell them to clean up their lives or go and sin no more. She did not tell them they were blessed of the earth, its inheriting meek or its glory bound pure. She told them that the only grace they could have was the grace they could imagine, that if they could not see it, they would not have it. Her words, baby Suggs' words of faith, fed them. Her heart encouraged them, and her clearing opened up a realm for them to release, dream, and manifest what they heard into their own lives. And this is the passage on page 104 that I think is extremely important for students to read and understand. And this is baby Suggs' Holy Sermon, pages 103 to 104. And I'll just read just a bit because it's quite long. Here, she said, in this here place, we flesh that weeps, laughs, flesh that dances on bare feet and grass. Right here in this one sentence, you can tell your students that this is an example of clear personification, right? That Morrison herself is putting sound on Black flesh, putting sound on Black bodies. And you have to also teach your students to read music metaphorically. It's not always going to be in the notes. It's sometimes in the metaphor. Music is in the metaphor as well. And so baby Suggs says to love it hard. Yonder, they don't love your flesh. They despise it. They don't love your eyes. They just as soon pick them out. And then I'll go on to read, saying no more, she stood up then and danced with her twisted hip the rest of what her heart had to say, while the others opened their mouths and gave her the music. Long notes held until the four-part harmony was perfect enough for their deeply loved flesh. So here, I am using, and you can use this example for your undergraduate students even, the example of the sermon, right, and music in the sermon, what baby Suggs says in terms of her words and how the music actually emanates from the people that are listening to her sermon, her words in the clearing. And for the rest of the sermon, baby Suggs lets her body speak when her lips are finished moving. Through expressive culture, the body spoke what the heart wanted to convey. She didn't allow her twisted hip to impede her agency, movement, and voice. This is where sound, movement, dance, music, and art let the words speak. Dance personified her heart, and movement strengthened her material body, fueling the continuation of song and rejoicing not only for herself, but for her community and the generations to follow. And I had an example here of baby Suggs's sermon that you could hear and the music that comes from it. But again, we will put that in the chat so that you can share with your students. And here I am also giving you all an example of what I think will be helpful to students as they tap into their literature, music, and spiritual sides in this piece of the novel. As we come to pages 307 to 308, at the end of the novel, this is just another example of how Morrison uses the theme of music and agency through the performative voices of women. And if we go to pages 307 now, we will be able to see. So let's read a bit of this passage. Quote, when the women assembled outside 124, Setha was breaking a lump of ice into chunks. She dropped the ice pick into her apron pocket to scoop the pieces into a basin of water. When the music entered the window, she was wringing a cool cloth to put on Beloved's forehead. Beloved, sweating profusely, was sprawled on the bed in the keeping room. Again, we have the keeping room. A salt rock in her hand. Both women heard it at the same time and both lifted their heads. As the voices grew louder, Beloved sat up, licked the salt, and went into the bigger room. Setha and she exchanged glances and started toward the window. They saw Denver sitting on the steps, and beyond her, where the yard met the road, they saw the rapt faces of 30 neighborhood women. Some had their eyes closed. Others looked at the hot, cloudless sky. Setha opened the door and reached for Beloved's hand. Together, they stood in the doorway. For Setha, it was as though the clearing had come to her with all its heat and simmering leaves, where the voices of women searched for the right combination, the key, the code, the sound that broke the back of words, building voice upon voice until they found it. And when they did, it was a wave of sound wide enough to sound deep water and knock the pods off chestnut trees. It broke over Setha, and she trembled like the baptized in its wash. The singing women recognized Setha at once and surprised themselves by their absence of fear when they saw what stood next to her. And so this is, again, an example of the singing women, the ways in which Morrison performatively puts voice at the end of the novel is a crucial example. A lot of the times you'll see in this particular novel that music is explicated, is inherent when the women gather, when the women are involved. We have the clearing, we have the keeping room, we have the end of the novel. We have different environments and examples where Morrison clearly points to Black music performance and Black music, the spirituals, the work songs in her novels. There was also a video that I had of a Toni Morrison interview where she explicated her reason of writing Beloved. But I will again put those links, because of the sort of technological challenges, I will put those links in the chat at the end. There are so many other instances of music in Morrison, but before I conclude, I was asked to contribute something musically. I want to contribute something musically to Morrison with a little bit of vital inspiration for you all. This piece is a tribute called Simply the Best. And if you know Toni Morrison well enough, you know her love of Black women musicians, from Nina Simone and all of the rest. And so this Simply the Best song was a song that was written by, or sung by, the late, great, legendary Tina Turner. But I find that it is a song that is especially appropriate for our beloved Morrison. Indeed, Toni Morrison was simply the best. Rest well, beloved. In a few moments, I will play the clip. All right. And that is it for today.
Thank you so much, Professor Hill.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for having me.
So we are at a point now where we can take questions for Professor Hill. If you have questions, please direct them to the Q&A button, which is at the bottom of your Zoom screen. I think we're all trying to absorb this really marvelous presentation. Thank you so much.
Oh, thank you. And I feel as though I was supposed to play the video on my laptop, but I did through the desktop. So hopefully you all were able to hear it. If not, there will be a link sent momentarily.
Lonnie, am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Okay. I just wanted to say thank you enormously, Professor Hill. And I know that the technical glitches caused some stress here, and I really admire the way you improvised with the laptop, and I think it was very effective, and particularly your own performance. I mean, all of it was the work songs and everything else, but your own performance at the end was very moving. And I think you left us with a very clear sense of how the students' experience of this novel can be deepened by encountering the music to which Morrison is clearly making reference in the passages that you opened for us. So thanks again very, very much.
Thank you so much, Andy. Thank you.
So Professor Hill, would you like to stop the screen share just so that your video
yes.
Yeah. Okay, great. So some really wonderful questions are already starting to come in.
Okay.
So one question from Meg Rolland of Lynn Benton Community College. She asks, can you please say a bit more about the sequencing of introducing students to the concept of music and literature and reading of the novel? Great question.
Yes, thank you so much. And I believe your name was Meg, I believe. Yes, thank you so much, Meg, for your wonderful question. One of the things, and I put this in my syllabus as well, Morrison and music, that I really feel that especially for undergraduate students who don't know anything at all about how to incorporate literature and music, that it is important to first introduce them to the ways in which Morrison incorporates music in her literature by reading articles in the New Yorker, reading articles, and as I explicated in the beginning of the presentation, articles by Emily Lordy, Daphne Brooks, right? People who have actually had direct communication with the author themselves, and they can sort of write about their experiences and the ways in which they have discovered and sort of uncovered music within Toni Morrison's literature directly as well. So I actually, for undergraduate students, I start like with a little bit of an icebreaker. I start by asking them and writing on the board, right? Like, what does music mean to them? When you think about the intersection of literature and music, what immediately comes to your mind, right? And specifically with Black literature and Black music performance, what specifically comes to your mind? And so we start to write on the board sort of a vision board of Morrison and music in the beginning, right, of class. And I have all of these adjectives, right, that students think about whenever they hear music, because music is all around us all the time, right? Students listen to music as they're waiting for the subway from New York, to Newark, or as they're walking home. Music envelops them constantly. And so I want students to begin to look at music as an analytical framework by which we can understand more deeply the efficacy of Toni Morrison's work, right? Because we all know that Toni Morrison's work is very, very complex. And sometimes, a lot of the times, it takes about 4 reads of Beloved, before we really sort of start to understand the intricacy and the detail of her writing. And so to really know the ways in which she admired Black women musicians in particular, and the ways in which her mother as an opera singer, right? The ways in which she heard blues music and blues poetry, how she was able to efficaciously reflect that in her writing. That's how I start students first to understanding music and Toni Morrison's literature, right? So we don't just jump to Beloved. Beloved is a very, very, very complex novel, right? Her first novel was The Bluest Eye in 1970, but for a couple of weeks, I ease students in to understanding who Toni Morrison is to us now, was as a Black woman writer, as an author that had all of these beautiful, brilliant ideas flowing through her mind, and as she sort of penned them effortlessly onto the page. So I have students have a really great understanding of who Morrison is first, because you can't really understand the music without understanding the writer or the artist themselves. So I make that a point, I make that a clear point for students first. And then we read, after knowing who Morrison is, we read her essays from The Source of Self-Regard, essays from Playing in the Dark, right? I think it's important for students to know Morrison and how she spoke in her own words about race, about history, about memory, right? That I want students to understand that. Then we get into the novels. Then we get into Beloved. Then we get into jazz, because that strong foundation has to be set first in terms of how students can understand her methodologically, right? That is a strong foundation that has to be set first before we can really even delve into the music. So that's sort of a brief recap of how I start teaching my students Toni Morrison.
Thank you. So I think there's some related questions, Professor Hill, from folks in the audience that I think you've addressed, but maybe it's just worth reading out these questions and explicating a little bit more because of the high level of interest. So E. Parsons, she asks, when you teach the novel, do you start by setting students up to look at the music, or do you spread these lessons out over the course of the reading? And it sounds like you're kind of using a mixed approach, but it's, if you can say a little bit more about that, I think that would be great. And then Simona Burr Taco, she asks about how the composition of the class affects how you teach it. Are students required to read the entire novel? How does this beautiful seminar function at the undergraduate level, right? How do they keep up with the work? And I think, you've spoken to this, just a moment ago, as well as in the course of your presentation. But I think, there's interest from folks to hear more about this. And finally, Michael Kramer asks, I'm curious to hear more about your sense of how to help students approach Morrison's relationship to music on two slightly different but related levels. First, when she refers out from her writing to music, as you were discussing in your presentation. And second, compared to when she became a musician herself in her writing in terms of her form.
Yes, I'm writing all this down. Yes, this is wonderful. Thank you so much to all three of our listeners on the virtual platform for these wonderful questions. I would like to first answer about, I believe it was about the influence of Black women musicians specifically with Toni Morrison. So when I think about the ways in which music and Black music performance influences her literature, I actually introduce students. Okay, so this is how I am looking at music and literature, right? It's not an either or in this class, it's a both and. So after I lay that solid foundation of who Toni Morrison is, I show various clips during class in terms of her interviews with various journalists so that they can really get into her brain to see how she thinks about race, how she thinks about history and memory, identity, etc. I teach students how to sort of pair, right? Because we're reading music in conversation with the literature. So I sometimes have students pair particular musicians' music with the literature that they're reading. So for example, the Baby Suggs Holy Sermon that we went through today, that it would be very much appropriate for either a student to interpret musically a spiritual song, a Black spiritual song in conversation with Baby Suggs' sermon, or a sort of contemporary take on a gospel hymn, right, etc. We're now getting to other genres of music, right? So it's not just the spirituals, the work songs, but it's also blues, it's also gospel, and it's soul. So all of these musicians, and some students may not be familiar with some of these musicians. So that's why day by day, I actually take time to have a theme for each week, right? Depending if I, sort of teach this class once a week or if I teach it twice a week, that there are particular themes each week, right? So we may have, Nina Simone and jazz, right? We may have sort of a particular jazz artist in conversation with the novel that particular week. And I really have enjoyed very much my students' creative presentations. They have done amazingly over the course of me teaching this course. That they themselves, the unique ways in which they read, Toni Morrison's music, I think is just, breathtaking. So I actually have students, I teach them, yes, and then I also have them do their own groundwork, their own soul work, that while they are reading this novel, what songs come to their minds as they're reading jazz or as they're reading The Bluest Eye, right? Because, music is prevalent in Toni Morrison's writing. And I want students to also, again, think about music as metaphor. It's not always Toni Morrison saying that this is a G flat, right? Or that this is a D sharp here in the novel. It's not like that. And jazz is not like that novel, right? Morrison is specifically reading music, jazz metaphorically into Black life and Black culture. And that is what we should show our students, right? Especially for people who may not even be music, who could not approach music in a theoretical way, like in terms of theory, people who don't know music in theory. It's okay. You don't have to be a musician to take this class, right? And so that's what I want, students to understand. And so we have different musicians from Aretha Franklin, Nina Simone, all of them, right? That we can put in conversation with her novels. I really like the question about, this is an undergraduate seminar. Do you expect the students to read the full novel? We take our time in this class, and just sort of a little bit of transparency. When I first taught this class, I actually did have, we read extensively. I'll just say that we read extensively in Morrison and music. And so after that first time teaching, I said, okay, I want to, because I always like to sort of evaluate things, and that semester went wonderfully, but I want students to not be in a rush to understand Morrison. I want them to really sort of take their time. So it may be 2 weeks that allows us to get through one novel, right? And that's okay. I have it sectioned out, right? So one day we'll read pages 1 to 80, right? And then the next week we'll read pages 1 and discuss it. And then next week we'll read pages 80 to 150 or 80 to 140, right? So I sort of break it up into sections so that students really aren't overwhelmed, because you cannot rush Morrison. She is not an author to be rushed in terms of understanding her. So that's one of the ways in which I approach my class. Let's see, writing to her music. I wrote writing as musicians. So I believe that I answered both of those latter 2 questions.
Yeah. So Professor Hill, you're getting so many questions. It's really lovely to see. There's so much interest in your talk. So some related questions. In addition to Morrison, are there other writers that you recommend to teach? or reference in relation to Morrison that you feel also engaged with pop music in your writing? Now, you spoke a little bit about this in your talk, right? Like you mentioned Nina Simone, you mentioned the writings of Daphne Brooks, the New Yorker piece, which I put in the chat for everyone's reference. Are there other authors and musicians that you like to pair?
Yeah. Oh, yes, that's a wonderful question. So my research brand is literature and music, right? That's my actually it's literature, music, and theology. So that's my research brand. And the classes that I teach, music is always filtered in, right? So I may have a class on Black women's autobiographies, and you may think, well, how can we incorporate music into that, right? We can, if we read Angela Davis's autobiography, right, we can sort of read particular civil rights activism songs, songs by Sweet Honey and the Rock. You know, I have students listen to those sort of great civil rights artists and activists, and I have students pair a particular song with a section, right, of the literature. And two, I think it's really important that when you teach, because we as professors learn from students just as much as students learn from us as well, right? It's very much reciprocal, this learning, this epistemological process. And so I think that that it's I heard an echo, I think, but I think that it's really important to teach students to also independently listen to and choose particular songs on their own, and then we come into class the next day discussing their findings, right? So I also want students to really think ethnographically, right, about this as well, as they're reading Morrison and music. But other texts that I would pair with sound, I mean, if you go through and extend the whole Black literary canon, you will find music inherent in just about every single text, right? A text from not only Toni Morrison, but there's James Baldwin as well. We read James Baldwin extensively in my classes. We read The Fire Next Time. We read The Amen Corner. And there are other novels by him as well, you know, that we also delve into. There's also Gloria Naylor as well, The Women of Brewster plays. We read Zora Neale Hurston's Their Eyes Were Watching God. You know, that is sort of a common text, you know, in all of my classes, whether it's undergraduate or graduate, where we really sort of read music in Hurston's writing, because as we know, Zora Neale Hurston was not only a novelist, an essayist, right, but she was an anthropologist, right? That she herself actually went to particular sites like Haiti, etc., to really have the sound of Black culture, Caribbean culture, right, to actually help her flesh out how she's writing. So, you know, sound is always important. Also, Jacqueline Woodson, who's a contemporary author, another Brooklyn. I remember going to a it's not a seminar, but an event where she was featured. And I remember asking her, because immediately in the first pages of Another Brooklyn, she talks about music, you know, in the urban environment where she's writing, in which the novel is set. And so I asked her, you know, what are the ways in which music influences her writing? And she began to, you know, sort of talk about, you know, her own sort of, as I remember correctly, this was years ago, but her own sort of personal soundtrack that she has, you know, when she's actually writing her novels. So, you know, music envelops a lot of what we do, not only artistically, but also literarily as well.
Thank you. This is really fabulous. Well, we are, there are so many questions for you that it's not unfortunately going to be possible to address them all in your hour-long workshop. But if we can keep you for just 1 minute longer, Professor Hill, before we transition to the optional Q&A for those who'd like to stay on until 2 o'clock Eastern with Andy Delbanco and myself, to talk about the grant application process. One question from Libby Metcalf that I wanted to offer, and then a really lovely quote from our colleague Brian Argenbright. So Libby asks, what challenges have you faced with offering this course? What tips do you have for us who are trying to inspire more interdisciplinary courses like your own? And then from Brian, not so much a question, but a comment. He just wanted to share, and I think this is just a nice closeout comment for us. The passage on page 308, it was as though the clearing had come to her with all its heat and shimmering leaves, where the voices of women search for the right combination, the key, the code, the sound that broke the back of words. And it reminds Brian of the power of transformative text that profoundly moves students. So I just thought it was a nice thing to leave.
Oh, yes.
But the challenges, well, right, that you've alluded to. And so if you could talk about how you adjust those in the context of your class.
Yes, I'm so glad for that last comment. It talks about the clearing it, and I actually talk about this in my forthcoming manuscript as well. But I talk about the ways in which music is transformative within African American literature and theology. And but this particular quote here, where the voices of women searched for the right combination, the key, the code, the sound that broke the back of words, immediately I am reminded of Zora Neale Hurston right when I read that quote, because there's a particular quote in Zora Neale Hurston's work, Their Eyes Were Watching God, where she talks about masters walking without words, walking without masters, right? Walking all together like harmony in a song. This is the sort of the first 2 pages of Their Eyes Were Watching God. And this is when Janie is sort of coming back from the storm, right? It's sort of a retrospective look before she tells Phoebe her testimony, her journey, etc. And so for me, I love that, because music, as myself as a musician, as a professional musician, as a violinist, and also as a professor that does this both and work, that music is central not only to who I am, but also it's essential to my career. It's essential to me inspiring students to sort of find a new avenue, a new way of artistry in literature, right? I always want students to have fun when they are reading these works, right? Find the love, find the passion within reading Black literature. That is what it's all about. It's about tapping into your inner person, your inner soul, and finding in the literature what speaks to you the most. Right. And music is something that speaks to a lot of us the most. And also in terms of the question with challenges that I face, the only challenge with Morrison and music that I in particular face, because the students are just wonderful, especially when they do their creative presentations, they understand what's happening. Seriously, they understand what's happening in the novel very well, and we discuss it in depth, like a kind of like a graduate seminar. And I know that these are undergraduate students. Now, I will say that in the section of undergraduate students where I teach a gen ed course, I probably would not have Beloved. I would probably have a novel like The Bluest Eye, or maybe Recitative, because sometimes there's a difference between undergraduates who choose the major English and then undergraduates who are gen ed, and they don't know anything about Morrison at all. So from that, I have to start from scratch. But my Morrison and music class is geared towards people who have sort of chosen English literature as their major. But with the gen ed courses, I still incorporate my Morrison and music element, right? And that I still have a Morrison text, and I still incorporate music in that. So, but with the Morrison and music class, the only challenge that I would have is in terms of deciding which novel sometimes to choose for particular students. But I would say my go-to novels are always Beloved, Jazz, and The Bluest Eye for students to really understand over the course of the semester what Toni Morrison is all about.
Thank you so much, Professor Hill. That was really fabulous.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
So we will be following up. The recording is going to be posted to our website,
Okay.
And links that Professor Hill mentioned, the recordings of music, for example, and other references that you've made in your talk. I'll be sure to send it.
Yes.
So thank you so
much. And I will send it as well. Yes. And thank you so much for all, just despite the technological sort of difficulties, I just really enjoyed sharing my passion, because my passion is teaching, it's my research, and it's literature, music, theology, it's all three. And it's really showing students the beauty, the brilliance, the ingenuity of not only Toni Morrison in particular, but the Black literary canon in general.
No, that was really fabulous. No, I mean, I think that you showed enormous grace under pressure. And I think our colleagues, we really appreciate your patience with us. So thank you.
Oh, thank you. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you again for your time with us. So we are now going to, so Professor Hill, I mean, you should feel free to leave. I know you are. And, I should also say, colleagues, Professor Hill joined us despite being on sabbatical. I actually hadn't realized that. So thank you for making time in what is, I know, very precious time.
Thank you so much. It was my pleasure. I enjoy sharing my passions with everyone. So thank you all so much for your beautiful questions and just for listening so intently.
Thank you again, Melanie. Wonderful.
All right. Thank you. Bye. Have a great day.
Take care.